And hello, everyone. My name is Binbin Li. I'm the associate.
Recording in progress.
Okay, I'm the associate editor of Integrative Conservation, and this is our monthly webinar series. And I'm also assistant professor at Kunshan University. And today I'll be the moderator for this webinar. And today we're really honored, and I'm also very happy to have Dr. Stuart Pimm joining us. And he is a very special person to me. So I do not need a paper to introduce him, but for no voice. So anyone else, you can hear me? So I think Stuart, you can hear me, right?
The voice is okay. The voice is fine. I will check with Professor Chen Jin what is going on his side.
Okay, got you. All right. Okay, so Stuart is a close collaborator, a close friend, and also he was my PhD advisor. And he's also the founder, pioneer, and also the leader for conservation science. And he was there, witnessed the conservation biology. This term was invented. And then the small group of scientists formed the Society of Conservation Biology, and seeing the whole discipline emerge, developed, and also help to shape the direction of conservation science. And he is a very productive scientist, and he produced more than 350 papers and 5 books. So while I'm accumulating my publication every day, I always question myself, how could I get to that level? It's probably really hard for my lifetime to do that. But Stuart definitely produced a lot of very important literature for ecology and also for conservation science. And he also has committed his time and life to bridge conservation policy and also actual conservation actions. And he also founded and also lead an NGO called Saving Nature, basically using science to inform underground conservation for restoration. And the NGO's work has covered a lot of places, including Africa, South America, and a lot of developing areas, and also maybe Southeast Asia. And Stuart probably will talk more about that. And his work has been highly recognized. He's one of the most cited environmental scientists in the world. And also he has been recognized for international awards as well. That's the only part I need a paper, because he has got so many awards, I cannot cite them or remember them. So in 2006, and he was awarded by the Dr. A.H. Henneken Prize for Environmental Sciences from the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences. And in 2010, and he got Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement. And in 2019, he won the International Cosmos Prize, which recognized his funding and directing Saving Nature, a nonprofit that uses donations for carbon emissions offsets to fund local conservation groups in areas of exceptional tropical biodiversity to restore their degraded lands. And also he got awards from Society of Conservation Biology. He got the Marsh Award and also the William Proctor Prize for Scientific Achievement from Sigma Xi. So with a lot of awards, and if you know Stuart has worked with him, you know he is a really nice person. And he's down to the earth, and he loves rum and beer, and he loves birding. And all of the crazy and interesting scientific ideas emerge a lot during the field work. So even for now, Stuart is still in the field right now in South Africa. So he enjoyed his field work and his work, and also for conservation. So today we're really honored to have him and talk about his research, but also his ideas of how conservation could work in the future, and also more relate to the recent international agenda and also to our journal as well. So without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Binbin. That was a lovely introduction. It's a great pleasure to talk to you. Congratulations on your journal. I'm going to try and give an overview of conservation science. I'm going to focus a lot of it on some of the questions I've done, some of the questions I've done with Professor Li. But then at the end, I'm going to sort of come back and talk about what I think some of the challenges are in editing any kind of journal in conservation. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and make sure I got the right one. Yes, share. And I'm now going to play my presentation. I'm going to play my presentation. Play. Okay, so I want to talk about this idea of integrative conservation, and I want to suggest an agenda. I want to suggest some of the things that you might be on the lookout. I want to really focus on two issues. The title, Conservation Effectiveness and the Contribution of Conservation Science, is a title of a paper I'm working on at the present. And in it, with colleagues from around the world, we talk about the state of biodiversity. And then we talk about the role of conservation-specific science. There are many things in conservation that are not unique to conservation. Protecting the planet or protecting land is not a new idea. People in Britain have been protecting the land for 1,000 years. I rather suspect in China, they've probably been doing it for 4,000 years. But there are certainly some ideas in conservation that are sort of uniquely conservation science. And I want to talk a little bit about them because those are the things that we are likely to encounter with this new journal. So finally, in the wrong place because of COVID, we had a COP15. And I was, like you all, hugely disappointed it couldn't be in Kunming. I would have been there had it been in Kunming. But nonetheless, it was chaired by China. And here is the China's Minister of Ecology and the Environment giving his opening address. And in it, he said, look, you know, the theme is ecological civilization. President Xi's shared future for life on Earth. And we should ensure biodiversity loss is halted and reversed by 2030. Now, that's an amazing challenge coming from a very senior politician. It's backed up by hundreds of other politicians around the world. The British Prime Minister signed on to this, as did President Biden in the US. And, you know, if that mission, if that aspiration is to be met, then it's up to us, it's up to me, it's up to you guys to make sure that it happens. So, what are the key points of this? Well, one of the important statements from COP15 was the 30% solution. The idea that we should be protecting 30% of the land, 30% of the ocean, and doing so by 2030. So I want to use that as a focus. It's a focus to which China is committed, both by protected areas and redlining, and Britain, the United States, and hundreds of other countries have committed to it too. We should look at what previous COPs have tried to do and how well we're meeting biodiversity targets. And then we want to use our conservation science, the work that we do, the work that will come to this journal, to address the issues of how we can do better. Well, to start off with, 30% is not going to be enough for everywhere. 30% will not save the Amazon. If we lose 70% of the Amazon forest, it will no longer be a rainforest. The work of the late Tom Lovejoy and Carlos Nobre, a leading Brazilian scientist, argues very persuasively that unless the Amazon retains most of its forest, it will revert to a dry, tropical savanna and lose much of its biodiversity. So while I'm going to argue that I think we can protect a lot of biodiversity with less than 30%, I think we need to be very clear that some parts of the world need much more protection. We need to protect a lot more of the Amazon than 30%. So what were the previous targets and did we achieve them? Well, in 2010, there was the idea that we should be able to protect 17% of the planet. Did we get there by 2020? Well, sort of. We got there by declaring that some areas of the planet were effectively protected. And we did it within the last few months of 2020, which I think is a cheat. I think it's not a true reflection of what we've achieved. The areas that were designated as effectively protected were in fact areas like the center of the Sahara, where there are very few people, where few conservation biologists go, and they were protected because nobody else goes there either. So I think we need to look very carefully at where we're protecting the planet and what it's achieving for biodiversity protection. In terms of future targets, my very dear friend, the late Ed Wilson, says, you know, we want to protect half Earth. So he wanted to protect 50%. And his vision of 50% was very much the inspiration for COP15 trying to protect 30%. 30% is not as good as 50%, but at least it's in the right direction. So how well are we doing with our biodiversity targets? Well, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Ecosystem Services says this is the state of the planet. It says that there are 8 million species on Earth. I think that's a very doubtful number. And the rate of species extinction is much higher than it should be. I think that's a good number, but I'm biased because it's my number. So Al Gore, the former United States president, in his book and movie, An Inconvenient Truth, talks about a mass extinction crisis with a rate of extinction 1,000 times higher than the background rate. And he got that information from this paper that I wrote close to 30 years ago. So what are the details of that calculation? Well, many people talk about the number of extinctions of species going extinct per day. And the problem with that is we do not know how many species there are. It's an extraordinary gap in our knowledge. We don't have a good idea of how many species of insect there are or how many species of fungi there are, let alone where they are. So with colleagues, I've argued that this number, this incredible important number for biodiversity, is still unknown. There really isn't a really good estimate of how many species there are. There are various ways in which we can estimate that, and I've certainly written papers about that, but it's one of the great challenges of conservation science. So there are just too many uncertainties for plants. My colleagues and I, including Peter Raven and Norman Myers when he was alive, he and they and I have come up with estimates of plants. There's probably about 15%, 15% of plants that still are out there to be described. There will be a good number of them in Asia. There will probably be a good number of them in southern China. But for other taxa, we don't know. What we can do, however, is calculate the death rate of species, the rate at which species are going extinct. If you look at the normal death rate for the United States, it's about 8,100 people per million people per year. We know that the death rate in the US during COVID was unusually high. It was higher than Canada, for example. And so we know what happens when there is an emergency. So we can calculate an extinction rate just as if it was a death rate. So we do that by looking at the species we know well, birds and mammals and amphibians, and more recently, plants. And we can calculate the death rate in pretty much the same terms. And these numbers are, between 50 and 500 extinctions per million species per year. We look at species for when they were first described, and we look at how many years we've known them, and then we calculate what fraction of species have become extinct in that interval. Now, one of the interesting things about those numbers, obviously, amphibians have a higher extinction rate than anything else. But if you look at those extinction rates, they are higher for species that were described before 1900 than species described in the last 123 years. And the reason for that almost certainly is that species that are new to science, species that we are still discovering in China, Asia, many other parts of the world, species that are recent discoveries are rare. That's why we have only recently found them. So they're rare, they have small ranges, and they're more likely to go extinct. So it means that taxa that we do not know well tend to have lower extinction rates because we're not looking at the species that are so desperately threatened. So we have to be careful how we interpret extinction rates when many species are not known. Species extinction rates, for example, for butterflies are very, very low. It's probably because we still do not know most of the world's butterflies. So what are the background rates? What's the rate we would expect? This is a very, very difficult and complex issue. The basic argument is you can use the fossil record, but the fossil record is very crude. It's not really appropriate to the species we know on land. And there is a paper that I've done by a very bright Swiss scientist, Yuri de Bost, where we have argued what the rate of extinction ought to be. The most compelling estimates are the rates of diversification, if you like, the birth rates of species. We know how fast species are being born by looking at their molecular phylogenies. And when we do that, we find that species are dying at between 100 and 1,000 extinctions per million species per year. And that's about 1,000 times faster than the rate at which species diversify. the rate at which molecular phylogenies show that species are being born. Now, this is important because we know from the work of Stu Buchart and many others how well conservation is reducing that extinction rate. And conservation science is working. We are slowing the rate of species extinction. We're not slowing it enough, but we are slowing it some. So the main way in which we prevent extinctions, the main way in which we are successful at reducing the extinction rate is by protecting habitats. So let's look at how well we are protecting biodiversity. This paper with my colleagues, Professor Jenkins and Professor Li, looks at protected areas around the world. It's a map that shows where the protected areas are in green, and then divides the world into two halves. The half of the Earth that has the least human impact, and the half of the Earth that has the most human impact. Not surprisingly, the places that are protected tend to be in the places where there are fewer of us. Most protected areas are not in the eastern United States, Western Europe, or eastern China. So can we look at this in some detail? Because if we ask our politicians to protect 30% of the world, they will probably give us more of the same. They will probably give us protected areas in the middle of nowhere. And are those protected areas any good for biodiversity? Now, this is a remarkable picture because I have been to two of the world's largest protected areas. I took that photograph of Sanjiang when I was with Binbin, I think 4 or 5 years ago. And we were up there, and that's a picture I've taken on the ground. But I have also seen the world's largest national park. It's the top end of Greenland. And I saw it because when you fly from the United States to Shanghai, when I fly to visit Professor Li in Kunshan, on a good day, you fly over the pole, right over the top. You go north and then south. When you do that, you see this amazing national park. Now, I've never been there on the ground. It's far too cold for a tropical biologist like me. But I know it has some species. And I know Sanjiang has some wonderful species too, because I've been there. But I think you get the point. These areas have relatively few species in them. So if we protect more of them, we're not going to be protecting more biodiversity. So let's look at how we're doing. I've created these Venn diagrams. Very roughly, we have half of the world in wilderness, with few people in it, half with a lot of people, and then we've protected 13% of the land surface. What happens if we put a species down upon the planet at random? In other words, what fraction of a species range should be in human-dominated areas, wilderness, or protected? And the answer is, if you have a species with a large range, it should have 13% of its range protected, 50% in wilderness, 50% in high human impact. This is a species with a large geographical range. What happens if we want a species with a small geographical range? So here I imagine that there are a lot of species of unicorns. Unicorns, you say? I've never seen a unicorn. But That's because unicorns are so rare because they have tiny geographical ranges. So imagine that there are lots of unicorns out there. What fraction of their ranges would be protected? Well, you might expect that 13%, that's about 1 in 6, would be in protected areas, half would be in wilderness, half would be in human-dominated. So it doesn't matter whether your species range is large or small, you would still expect these fractions. So that's the statistical null hypothesis. If we look at species with large geographical ranges, that's about what we expect. About 13% of their ranges are protected. And if we expanded their range to 50% of the wild areas of the planet, we would get close to 50% protected. So species with large ranges are protected as much as we would expect. What about the species with small geographical ranges? Well, the remarkable thing is if we look at species with the most vulnerable populations, with ranges less than 100 square kilometers, we've protected anywhere from 25% to 75% of their ranges. So we've done very much better than expected. If we were to protect half of the planet, we wouldn't get much better protection than we've got already. Okay, so Professor Li and I decided we ought to look at what's happening in China. How has China done this? And we ought to look at how China has done it for many reasons. China has a lot of biodiversity. It has a lot of people. And it's only been protecting its biodiversity for relatively short periods of time, so we can look at how the protection increased. So this is a map that shows the extent of China from the far north down through and Taiwan and through the other territories to the south of this map that I can't fit on the map. So it looks at the entirety of China. And if you look at where the protected areas are, they are mostly in the west. They were mostly established early. And you can see that the growth of protected areas really began to expand in the mid-1980s. This shows the total area protected, and it also shows those that are in national nature reserves. If we look at what has been protected, it's mostly been montane grasslands and shrublands like Sanjianhuan, but very slowly and steadily, the fraction of forests, especially moist forests, is increasing. So there has been a progressive increase in the protection of China's habitats. So in our paper, we really contrast the different protections. So we look at areas like those up on the Tibetan Plateau. That photograph at the top won Professor Li an international prize for her photography. The photograph in the middle is also one of hers too. What we find is within China as well, that species with small geographical ranges are better protected than those with large ones. The Chinese are doing things right in terms of protecting biodiversity. There's another point too. This is another paper that Professor Li and I have done, which looks at how well protecting giant pandas has done in protecting biodiversity. And if you look at the endemic species of mammals and birds and amphibians in China, you see that many of them are being protected because we're also protecting giant pandas. So in short, we're doing a much better job of protecting biodiversity than we might think. So I've been discussing a half Earth with Ed Wilson before he died. There he is on the right of the photograph, I'm on the left. And I've argued with Ed that we need to be very careful about just asking for area for the sake of it. And Ed agreed. He said, look, we need to, if we want half Earth or 30% of Earth, we need to prioritize it. So how can we do better? How can we do better than we've got? Now, I'm going to play a video. I hope it comes across well. If it doesn't, please let me know. We can map out the distribution of many species now in considerable detail. These are birds, and they show that the warm, wet tropics are where most of the species are. Mammals show a broadly similar pattern. These are the places with the greatest concentration of species, and it's likely to be true for most species. Amphibians, for example, show a similar pattern, and while we have less detailed data for plants, it's almost certainly true for them too. But just looking at species is not sufficient. We need to dig deeper. Let's look again at the distribution of bird species. In the Amazon, there are the greatest numbers of species. But if we look at where species have smaller than the median range size, those distributions are profoundly different. They concentrate in Central America and in the northern Andes, and in places like the coastal forests of Brazil. That's important because species with small ranges are much more vulnerable to extinction than species with large ranges. So let's look as an example at one of those areas that I showed in that previous map that have high concentrations of small-ranged species. These are the coastal rainforests of Brazil. When you look at the satellite imagery, you see that those areas have lost much of their forest. Only the green is forest, and much of the forest is gone. That embayment here is where the city of Rio de Janeiro is. Let's look at that in more detail. When you look at the forest cover in detail, you see immediately a lot of the forest is in small fragments, small patches. So let me take those patches out. So here I am removing the forest that's in fragments smaller than a square kilometer, 100 hectares. That's what the forest looks like. Now, that view of the forest is not really that much different than if you were looking at forest in Yunnan. Looking at forest in many parts of China, it's that same mosaic of small habitat patches and areas converted to agriculture. And we can do some detailed mapping here and look at how many species we think are likely to be present in those areas. What I've done here is to color code the area by how many threatened species there are, and then drape it over a three-dimensional vision of the mountains of this area. And you can see that the greatest concentration of threatened species is in the Union Biological Reserve. Now, fragments we know a good deal about because we've done the right conservation science. Here I am sitting next to the late Tom Lovejoy. Tom and my wife Julia and I would get together every year for a good bottle of wine, and I would give a seminar. And Tom's study of the effects of fragmentation done in the Amazon is without doubt the most important ecological experiment that has ever been done. He created a set of experimental plots, and he looked at how fast the species disappeared from them. Briefly, small fragments lost more species, and they lost them more quickly than large fragments. Combining that work with studies that Tom Brooks did, Tom is now the chief scientist at IUCN, with work that he did in Africa, you get this relationship. And what this relationship shows you is something profoundly useful for conservation. It shows that fragments need to be about 100 square kilometers if they are to slow the rates of species losses. That's a practical conservation result.
We identify the places where the greatest number of species are at risk of extinction. And when we do that, we often find they're in very fragmented landscapes. They're not in large areas of continuous forest like the Amazon, but they're in the biodiversity hotspots, and those places have already lost a lot of their habitats. A good example of this is in the forest to the east of the city of Rio de Janeiro in coastal Brazil. This map shows the fragments and the number of threatened species that they contain.
We have not just merely destroyed so much of the world's tropical forests. What we have left behind is in tatters, in fragments. Those fragments are often too small for species to maintain viable populations. There just aren't enough males to go around for the females and females to go around for the males. And of all the places, of all the fragments, one that I thought was particularly tragic was the one immediately behind me. This is the Union Biological Reserve in coastal Brazil, about 100 miles east of the city of Rio de Janeiro. Because in this isolated patch of forest are a whole load of species on the brink of extinction, the most charismatic of which is a beautiful little monkey called the golden lion tamarin. And the golden lion tamarins in that fragment could not go forth and multiply into the forest over there because there was the cattle pasture behind me. And when I saw that cattle pasture for the first time about 8 years ago, a cattle pasture just like the one I'm standing in, I thought it has to go. And so we have made it go away. This is a restored forest. I helped raise money for my friends at the Asociação Mica Leão Dourado, the Golden Lion Tamarin Association. I've planted this forest, and it now connects that once isolated fragment of forest in the Union Biological Reserve to a much larger area of forest over in this direction. It's what we call a biological corridor. And it means that the golden lion tamarins that were once imprisoned in this forest island, this forest fragment behind me, can now cross through these small but growing trees and go and find new habitats, new homes, new places for their tamarin families.
So this is what the project looked like in 2007, a barren hillside, very badly overgrazed. After about 5 years, it looked like that, and now it looks like this. So this is very, very practical conservation science. and it's informed by what we know about fragmented populations. It's science that comes out of conservation. So I want to conclude by thinking of this agenda that I have proposed for you at the journal, and to talk about what I think the issues are that are really important to what we do. And they group into sort of really two things, two clusters. Here we are, there's 4 issues about, actually there's only 3, I can't count. That's because I put this slide in this morning before I had a cup of coffee. The state of biodiversity. We are slowing the rate of extinction. And we need to document that, and we need to be aware of that. There are lots of people who are telling you that the world is going to hell, and it's not. We are good at what we're doing. The second point is that populations are recovering. Many are not. Every 2 years, there is a report called the Living Planet Index, and it is truly dreadful. It's intended to get people to give money to a large conservation group. And it says, you know, we're losing 90% of biodiversity. We're not. We are recovering a lot of populations. Waterbirds in many parts of the world, North America, Europe, some parts of China. Waterbirds are now doing better than they were 50 years ago. So we are recovering some populations, not all, but we ought to have good data on what we're doing and whether it's a success. And as you have heard, we are protecting the right habitats and often in the right places. We are doing a better job of protecting the most vulnerable species. Oh, here we go. 2 issues, and there were 4 of them. I really needed the coffee this morning. So, what's conservation science got to do with it? What are we doing? What are what's the science behind what we do? Well, there's genetic rescue. There's rescuing populations that have become too small to be viable. I worked on the Florida panther, an animal that was down to fewer than 20 or 30 animals and was becoming massively inbred. I know from work done with my colleagues at the Chinese Academy of Sciences that something like 15% of giant pandas are in populations that are too small to have a long-term future, because they are going to go extinct because of many problems, including genetic inbreeding. There is a large literature on plant and animal introductions. Not all are successful, and some are desperately difficult. If we're going to save small, isolated populations of giant pandas, for example, we are going to have to move pandas around. We are going to have to try and create viable populations by taking pandas in captivity and putting them into small wild populations. That is going to be a politically enormously difficult issue, because generally when you try and introduce animals into the wild, they die. And I wouldn't want to be the person who introduced pandas into an isolated mountain range in southern Sichuan and find that those animals were dead within 6 months. It's going to be a difficult process, but we better learn how to do plant and animal introductions, and there is an increasingly good literature about that. Much better solution is to create habitat corridors. I showed you an example of that in the work that we do for saving nature, because we realize that creating habitat corridors is an effective way of doing science, and getting populations to meet. And finally, there's this whole issue of where we should put protected areas. They argued that we, the conservation community, and we, the conservation managers in China, are doing a better than expected job. We are protecting species better than by chance, but this is something that we need to study carefully. And we need to have detailed information about where species are. I have recently published a paper with a lot of colleagues mapping out species distributions in very great detail to improve the range maps that are provided by IUCN. And we did that by using eBird, the crowdsourced citizen science effort that now has 1 billion observations. For species other than birds, we have iNaturalist, an idea that was conceived in my laboratory when its co-founder, Scott Lowry, was a graduate student of mine. We are getting very, very much better at having information on where species are. But there's a problem in China. The problem in China is that the Chinese are using a different system. I understand why that happens, but there's going to come a point where if we're going to set conservation priorities, not just in China, but in China and Myanmar and Laos and Vietnam and all the other regions in Asia, we're going to have to come together and ensure that our databases are compatible with each other. I suspect, since I believe she's going to be involved in this journal, that Alice Hughes may be listening. And she is constantly reminding us that far too many species boundaries end at country boundaries. We have to work together to come up with mutually accessible databases of where species are. All these are fundamental challenges for conservation, things that we need to be able to do, things that we need to be able to know if we're going to do conservation well. Finally, I want to share just a few thoughts about my editorial experience. I have more than 40 years of being an editor. I wanted to think it might be 50, but it's probably closer to 40 than 50. And that included 11 years of being on the editorial board of Science. When I took on the editorial job at Science, it was to reject 80% of all the papers that were submitted there. So I believe that I may have rejected more ecology and conservation and environment papers than anybody else. That makes me probably a very unpopular person. But the reality was that that was my job, and journals like Science and Nature, journals like Current Biology, where I'm still an editor, need to make a tough choice about what papers can go out for further review. The advice I was given at Science was read the title and perhaps the abstract. Now, yes, I always read the title and I always read the abstract. But when you're preparing a journal article, especially for this new one, think very carefully about what the title is. And as Professor Li knows, I write and rewrite and rewrite and rewrite the abstracts. They are going to be essentially, if you're going to convince the editors that your work is important. And finally, a particular plea to my wonderful Chinese colleagues. I have many, many friends, many co-authors in China, and I see and review probably a paper a week for China, and the figures are often really terrible. I need a microscope. I need a electron microscope to see the figures. If you want your paper to be a success, make sure that you can understand the figures. Make sure somebody who doesn't speak your language can understand the figures. My third point is that there is a program out there called Grammarly. I have the professional version of Grammarly. I think it costs me about 50 euros a year. I use it all the time because even having written 350 papers and 5 books, even I don't get my grammar right. It's very, very hard writing in a second language. Use the tools available. Grammarly is a great program. Run your paper through Grammarly. It'll make your reviewers nicer people. And finally, I worry about the difficulty of publishing truly original work. You know, as a Laowai, I have 7 papers on giant pandas. And I think that's because there are probably about 7,000 papers on giant pandas. And so I only have a very small fraction of them. But there is, I think, a tendency to write a paper which isn't particularly original, but because somebody has come up with a new technique. Somebody says, Maxent, I'm going to apply Maxent to some problem. Now, I have a particular dislike of Maxent, and this is not the place to talk about it. But I think the difficulty is going to be in this field of conservation, as applied to Asia, of coming up with what the key questions are. And the only way that you come up with good questions is to have lots of colleagues to share your ideas. And I think this seminar series is an absolutely wonderful way of doing that. And so with that, thank you so much for your attention. Thank you for listening to me.